In the summer of 1943, as Allied forces fought their way through the brutal mountain terrain of Sicily, one American general stood on a magazine cover while simultaneously standing on the precipice of professional destruction. His name was Terry Allen, and his face stared out from the August 9th edition of Time magazine, crowned with the headline celebrating him as one of America's greatest combat commanders. 2 days before that magazine hit newsstands, he'd been fired. This wasn't just any relief of command. This was the sacking of the man who had led the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, through some of the fiercest combat of World War II. The division that had spearheaded the invasion of North Africa. The division that had defeated German Panzers when American forces were still learning how to fight. The division that soldiers across the theater both admired and feared in equal measure. And the man who had molded them into that fearsome fighting force was now being sent home in disgrace. The story of Terry Allen is one that cuts to the heart of a question that has haunted military organizations since the beginning of warfare itself. What do you do with a commander who wins every battle but refuses to play by the rules? What happens when the very qualities that make someone exceptional in combat make them impossible to control in peace? And what does it tell us about power when the people who claim to want victory the most are the first to destroy those who deliver it? Terry de la Meza Allen didn't come from humble beginnings. Born in 1888 at Fort Douglas, Utah, he was military royalty. His father was a career Army colonel. His maternal grandfather had fought at Gettysburg. The military was in his blood, the family business, stretching back generations. By every measure, Terry Allen should have been a textbook success story, climbing the ranks with the smooth assurance of someone born to command. Instead, he failed out of West Point, twice. That's not a detail to gloss over. In an army where your West Point class ring open doors and created lifelong networks of loyalty and advancement, Allen had no ring to show. He eventually earned his commission through Catholic University's ROTC program, a path viewed with disdain by the Point's graduates. He entered the officer corps already marked as an outsider, someone who hadn't earned his place through the traditional channels. But what Allen lacked in credentials, he made up for in raw talent and sheer audacity. When America entered World War I, while thousands of officers maneuvered for safe positions and career-enhancing assignments, Allen found a way to get himself into combat. Not just into combat, but into the thick of it. He brazenly crashed a graduation ceremony for an infantry officer's combat command course, stood in line with the actual graduates, and bluffed his way into receiving a completion certificate he hadn't earned. The move was pure Terry Allen, a combination of guts, cunning, and a complete disregard for proper procedure. In France, Allen commanded an infantry battalion at just 30 years old and led patrols into no man's land himself. When a German bullet tore through his mouth, shattering molars on both sides and leaving him with a permanent whistle in his speech, he refused medical evacuation. They sent him to an aid station. He ripped off his wound tag and returned to the front lines. He was shot again. By the war's end, he'd earned the Silver Star for heroism and a reputation as someone who led from the front. Consequences be damned. After the war, Allen represented the Army in a 300-mile horse race across central Texas, a grueling test of endurance pitting cavalry against cowboy. He won it in 101 hours and 56 minutes of continuous riding. As a young lieutenant in 1913, he'd led just 6 soldiers against 30 Mexican cattle rustlers who'd crossed the border. They captured or killed all of them. This was the man George Marshall reached down through the ranks to promote in 1940. With war clouds gathering over Europe and the Army desperate for aggressive commanders, Marshall jumped Lieutenant Colonel Allen over 900 more senior officers and gave him a general's star. It was an extraordinary vote of confidence, a signal that the Army was looking for fighters, not bureaucrats. What Marshall may not have fully appreciated was that Allen came as a complete package. You couldn't get the brilliant tactical mind and the inspiring combat leadership without also getting the hard drinking, the disdain for spit and polish regulations, and the bone-deep conviction that combat effectiveness mattered more than anything else. Allen's philosophy was simple. Keep your weapons clean, keep your men trained. Everything else was what he called chicken shit, meaningless regulations that did nothing but interfere with the mission. In an army increasingly dominated by men who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, Allen was about to become a very dangerous problem. When Allen took command of the 1st Infantry Division in 1942, he inherited America's most storied unit, but one that had been training stateside while the world burned. These men were about to face Wehrmacht veterans who'd conquered most of Europe. Allen needed to transform them, and fast. He did it by making them believe they were already better than everyone else. Allen told his soldiers they were special. Not in some vague motivational sense, but as a concrete fact. They were the 1st Division. They'd been first in World War I. They'd be first in this war too. He pushed them relentlessly in training, but he also fought for them like a junkyard dog. When his men needed better equipment, Allen badgered supply officers until he got it. When they deserved an extra pass into town, he gave it. When rear echelon officers tried to enforce regulations that Allen thought were stupid, he ignored them. His assistant division commander was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president. Roosevelt was 54 years old, had a bad heart, and used a walking stick because of arthritis. By any reasonable measure, he had no business being anywhere near a combat zone. But Roosevelt shared Allen's philosophy that leaders belonged with their men, not behind a desk. Together, they created a division culture that was profoundly different from the rest of the Army. The Big Red One didn't just think it was the best division in the Army, it thought it was the only division that mattered. In November 1942, they led the invasion of North Africa, landing at Oran, Algeria, as part of Operation Torch. It was America's first major offensive against Axis forces, and for many of these men, their first time under fire. The early results were mixed. The Americans were learning on the job, making mistakes that cost lives. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German Panzers under Erwin Rommel delivered a devastating blow to American forces, sending them reeling backward. But Allen's 1st Division held more than held. At the Battle of El Guettar in March 1943, Allen's men handed German forces their first major defeat at American hands. When German tanks came rolling forward, expecting to crush green American troops, they instead ran into a division that had learned from its mistakes and was ready to fight. The Big Red One stopped the German assault cold, inflicting heavy casualties, and proving that American soldiers could match the Wehrmacht blow for blow. The victory made Allen a hero. It also made him untouchable, at least for a while, but it also deepened something that would eventually destroy his command: the division's absolute loyalty to Terry Allen above all else. When the North African campaign ended in May 1943, the Big Red One had been in continuous combat for months. They'd fought hard, bled hard, and won. Now they were being pulled back to Oran, Algeria, to rest and refit before the next operation. What happened next became the stuff of legend, though which version of the legend you believe depends on whose account you trust. According to Omar Bradley, then commanding 2nd Corps and Allen's immediate superior, the 1st Division went completely off the rails. From Tunisia to Arzu, Allen's soldiers left a trail of looted wine shops and outraged mayors. But it was in Oran itself that things really exploded. Services of supply troops, those rear echelon units who'd been stationed in Oran throughout the campaign, had exclusive access to certain clubs and facilities. When combat troops from the 1st Division tried to enter and were turned away, they didn't file a complaint through proper channels. They liberated Oran a second time. Soldiers from the Big Red One swarmed through the city in what Bradley described as running amok. Property was damaged. Wine flowed freely. Military police who tried to restore order found themselves outnumbered and outmatched. For several days, the 1st Division essentially occupied Oran, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. Bradley was mortified. This wasn't how a professional army behaved. This was indiscipline on a scale that threatened the entire command structure. When word reached Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, he gave Bradley what one account described as a royal chewing out. But here's where things get complicated. Because there's another version of this story, one that paints a very different picture. Combat soldiers had just spent months living in foxholes, eating cold rations, and watching their friends die. They'd done everything asked of them and more. Now they were back in a city with actual beds, actual food, and actual drinks, and they were being told that the clubs and facilities were reserved for troops who'd spent the entire war in safety and comfort. The supply clerks and administrators who'd never heard a shot fired in anger got the good spots. The infantry who'd won the campaign were expected to be grateful for whatever was left over. From that perspective, what happened in Oran wasn't a riot. It was an expression of something that had been building for months. The combat soldiers were making a statement about who really mattered in this war. Allen's response to the whole affair was classic Terry Allen. He didn't issue a grand apology. He didn't crack down with harsh punishments. He made it clear he stood with his men. Yes, things had gotten out of hand. Yes, some soldiers had crossed lines, but they were also his soldiers. They'd earned the right to blow off steam, and anyone who wanted to make a federal case out of it could take it up with him personally. Bradley saw this as proof that Allen had utter disregard for discipline. Allen saw it as loyalty to his troops. Neither was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. But this incident, more than any single battle, marked the beginning of the end for Terry Allen's time with the Big Red One. George Patton was, in many ways, cut from similar cloth to Terry Allen. Both were cavalrymen. Both were aggressive to the point of recklessness. Both believed that the purpose of an army was to close with and destroy the enemy, and that everything else was secondary. Both had contempt for officers who'd never led troops in combat, and both had an ability to inspire fierce loyalty in the men they led. But there were critical differences. Patton came from wealth and privilege. He'd graduated from West Point. He cultivated a carefully constructed public image, complete with ivory-handled pistols and theatrical posturing. Patton loved the spotlight and knew how to work it. When he insulted someone, it was usually calculated for effect. Allen, by contrast, was rough around the edges. He dressed like a combat soldier, often going without haircuts and wearing rumpled uniforms. He was the only American general in the European theater who preferred sleeping on the ground rather than a cot or bed. He avoided publicity. When he insulted someone, it was usually because he meant it. Patton and Allen argued constantly. They disagreed about tactics, about leadership, about how to handle men. Their confrontations could be volcanic. In one heated exchange about soldier uniforms, Patton called Allen's troops yellow bellies and sons of bitches. The two men frequently insulted each other with a venom that would have ended most professional relationships. Yet Patton recognized something in Allen that he couldn't ignore. The man knew how to win battles. When Eisenhower criticized the 1st Division's discipline, Patton contradicted him directly. "I told him he was mistaken," Patton wrote, "and that anyhow, no one whips a dog before putting him into a fight." This was more than just defending a subordinate. Patton understood what Allen brought to the table. The 1st Division under Allen wasn't the most disciplined unit in the Army. It wasn't the most polished, but it was hard, experienced, and aggressive. Most importantly, it was the kind of division that could take a punch and hit back harder. When planning for the invasion of Sicily began, Patton fought for Allen's division to lead the assault at Gela. The initial plan called for the untested 36th Infantry Division to take that beachhead. Patton went to Eisenhower and demanded a change. "I want those sons of bitches," he told Ike, referring to the 1st Division. "I won't go without them." Eisenhower refused. Patton went over his head, directly to George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall sided with Patton and overruled Eisenhower. It was an extraordinary breach of protocol, and it cemented Allen's position as someone who existed outside the normal chain of command. Patton had just demonstrated that Allen was too valuable to lose, no matter what the rulebook said. But that protection came with a hidden cost. Every time someone intervened to save Allen, every time he got away with behavior that would have ended another officer's career, it reinforced the perception that he was untouchable. And in a military bureaucracy, being perceived as untouchable is one of the most dangerous things you can be. On July 10, 1943, the 1st Infantry Division stormed ashore at Gela, Sicily. It was their second amphibious assault, and this time they faced prepared Italian defenses backed by German armor. The landing was chaos. Friendly fire from naval anti-aircraft guns had decimated the 82nd Airborne's parachute drop the night before. German Panzers from the elite Hermann Goering Division counterattacked almost immediately, nearly pushing the Americans back into the sea. This is where Bradley, despite his many criticisms of Allen, was forced to acknowledge what made the Big Red One special. I question whether any other U.S. division could have repelled that charge in time to save the beach from tank penetration, Bradley later wrote. Only the perverse Big Red One, with its no less perverse commander, was both hard and experienced enough to take that assault in stride. A greener division might easily have panicked and seriously embarrassed the landing. Allen's response to the German counterattack has become legendary. As panzers rolled toward the beach and soldiers looked nervously toward their commander, Allen reportedly said, "Hell, we haven't begun to fight. Our artillery hasn't been overrun yet." It was vintage Allen, simultaneously reassuring his men that the situation wasn't hopeless, while also making it clear what hopeless would actually look like. His men held. The German attack was thrown back. The beachhead was secure. But Gela was just the beginning. After securing the beach, Allen led his division into Sicily's mountainous interior, slogging through some of the most difficult terrain in the Mediterranean. The Germans had chosen their defensive positions brilliantly, turning every hilltop town and mountain pass into a fortress. Troina, the highest town in Sicily, became the anchor of the German defensive line. The Battle of Troina lasted a week and was among the bloodiest fights of the Sicilian campaign. German forces launched 24 separate counterattacks against Allen's division. Some 1st Division units lost more than half their strength assaulting the mountain positions. Artillery battalions fired until their gun barrels were dangerously overheated. Fighter bombers were called in for massive airstrikes. The fighting was house to house, room to room, the kind of grinding attrition that broke units and shattered men. But Allen wouldn't quit. He kept attacking, kept pushing, kept demanding more from his soldiers. Years later, captured German prisoners would say they'd been ordered to hold Troina at all costs. Allen's soldiers took it anyway. Patton called it the hardest battle of the Sicily campaign. Lieutenant General John Lucas said it was the toughest fight of the war to that point. The week Troina fell, Terry Allen appeared on the cover of Time magazine. 2 days before that cover appeared on newsstands, Bradley fired him. The relief came without warning, delivered with brutal efficiency. While Patton was distracted, dealing with the fallout from his infamous soldier-slapping incidents, Bradley sent 3 telegrams to Allen's command post. The first relieved Allen as commanding general of the 1st Division. The second relieved Roosevelt as assistant commander. The third announced Allen's successor, Major General Clarence Hubner. Bradley's official justification was that a change of senior command was needed after the initial assault on Troina had failed. This was, to put it mildly, a creative interpretation of events. The failed initial assault had been conducted by the 39th Infantry. a unit from the 9th Infantry Division that had been temporarily attached to Allen's command just days before the attack. Blaming Allen for that setback was like blaming a football coach for a play called by someone else's assistant. In reality, Bradley had been looking for an excuse to fire Allen for months. The Oran incident had embarrassed him. Allen's maverick style clashed with Bradley's by-the-book approach to command. Most importantly, Bradley believed that Allen's influence had made the entire 1st Division increasingly temperamental, disdainful of both regulations and senior commands. This last point gets to the heart of what truly bothered Bradley. It wasn't just that Allen broke rules. It was that his soldiers had started to think like him. The whole division had assumed Allen's cavalier attitude, as Bradley put it. They believed they were exempt from normal Army standards because of their combat record. They viewed themselves as elite, separate from the rest of the military. Worst of all, they were loyal to Terry Allen first, to the 1st Division second, and to the Army command structure a distant third. To Bradley, this was a cancer that threatened to spread. If every successful combat commander started building personal armies loyal only to them, how could you maintain coherent military operations? How could you enforce standards and discipline? How could senior commanders like Bradley actually command if divisional generals simply ignored orders they didn't like? Allen was devastated. He'd led the 1st Division through 10 months of brutal combat. He'd never lost a battle. His men would have followed him into hell if he'd asked. And now he was being sent home in disgrace, with barely an explanation, while his soldiers prepared for the next phase of operations. Patton tried to soften the blow. When Allen came to see him, Patton suggested that perhaps this was actually a good thing, that Allen might be getting moved out to prepare him for promotion to Corps command. It wasn't true. Patton knew it wasn't true, but what else could he say? The axe had fallen, and even Patton couldn't lift it. Understanding why Allen was really fired requires understanding the politics swirling around the highest levels of Allied command in 1943. This wasn't just about one difficult general. It was about competing visions for what the American Army should become. Eisenhower, elevated to Supreme Allied Commander, was deeply invested in creating a modern professional military that could coordinate massive multinational operations. In Ike's view, the sprawling nature of modern warfare made individualism dangerous. Misfits defeat the purpose of the command organization essential to the supply and control of the vast land, air, sea, and logistical forces that must be brought to bear against the enemy, he later wrote. Officers needed to be team players willing to subordinate their own instincts and preferences to the larger mission. Bradley, commanding 2nd Corps in his first frontline position after spending nearly 3 decades in the Army without hearing shots fired in combat, was particularly sensitive about maintaining authority. He would eventually relieve more division and regimental commanders than any other senior U.S. general in World War II. For Bradley, Allen represented everything he distrusted. An officer who prioritized results over process, who inspired fanatical loyalty in his troops while showing minimal respect for higher command, who viewed regulations as suggestions rather than requirements. But there was a third power player in this drama, General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. And Marshall had a very different perspective. Marshall had known Allen since the 1920s, when both served at the infantry school. Marshall had been impressed enough to write in Allen's efficiency report that he was qualified as commanding officer of a regiment and in wartime a division. When Marshall needed aggressive commanders in 1940, he'd jumped Allen over 900 more senior officers to give him a general's star. And when Marshall visited the 1st Division just before it headed to Sicily, he'd come away impressed, noting that the division had won the respect and admiration of all who have seen it in action. 3 months before the relief, Eisenhower had visited Allen's command post. He'd found Allen tired, grumbling about casualties, appearing disconsolate and passive. Ike's assistant noted that Allen had been up most of the night on duties. Despite this, Eisenhower concluded that Allen was too tired to continue and should be relieved. But here's the thing. If Allen was too tired in May, why did Eisenhower let him lead the 1st Division through the entire Sicily campaign in July and August? The answer is that tiredness was never the real issue. It was a convenient excuse, a way to remove someone whose command style clashed with Eisenhower's vision for the Army. When a despondent Allen arrived back in the United States expecting his career to be over, Marshall had a different idea. Within weeks, Marshall was looking for a new division for Allen to command. By October 1943, just 2 months after Bradley had fired him and declared him not fit to command, Terry Allen was given the 104th Infantry Division. This was extraordinary. Relieved division commanders weren't supposed to get second chances, especially not to command other divisions in combat. The normal career path after such a relief was either a training position stateside or early retirement, but Marshall overruled that unwritten rule, just as he'd overruled normal promotion procedures to make Allen a general in the first place. Marshall understood something that Eisenhower and Bradley either couldn't or wouldn't see. Modern warfare didn't just need managers and coordinators. It also needed fighters, men who could inspire soldiers to do the impossible. Allen was a fighter, and in Marshall's view, America couldn't afford to waste men like that because they didn't fit the bureaucratic mold. The relief of Terry Allen, then, wasn't just about one difficult general. It was the opening battle in a larger war about what kind of officers the American Army would promote and celebrate. Eisenhower and Bradley wanted cooperative team players who followed orders and maintained discipline. Marshall believed there was still room for mavericks, who might bend or break rules, but who knew how to win. In the short term, Marshall won that battle by getting Allen back into combat. In the long term, Eisenhower and Bradley's vision would dominate. The modern American military has very little room for officers like Terry Allen. The 104th Infantry Division that Allen took over in October 1943 was everything the Big Red One wasn't. These were draftees and newly enlisted men, not combat veterans. They had no storied history, no proud traditions, no sense that they were special. They were, in other words, a blank slate. Allen set about making them into his image of what a fighting division should be. But he learned from his relief. This time, discipline was one of the first things on his agenda. He made it clear he would not tolerate Maldens in his division, a reference to the slovenly Willie and Joe characters in Bill Mauldin's famous cartoons. Soldiers would keep themselves clean, their equipment in perfect working order, their weapons maintained. The criticism that he was a poor disciplinarian? Allen was determined to prove it wrong. But he also taught his men something that few other divisions mastered: night fighting. Based on his experience in Tunisia and Sicily, Allen was convinced that attacking at night kept casualties low by avoiding German artillery and machine gun fire. The 104th trained for night operations 30 to 35 hours a week, 3 to 4 times what the Army required. Allen's constant refrain to his troops became legendary. Find 'em, fix 'em, fight 'em, take the high ground, inflict maximum damage to the enemy with minimum casualties to ourselves. Night attack, night attack, night attack. The result was a division that became known as the Timberwolves, adopting as their motto, "Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves." In September 1944, the 104th deployed to Europe. Allen's first stop was the American cemetery in Normandy, where he visited the grave of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Roosevelt had landed at Utah Beach on D-Day, the oldest man and highest-ranking officer on the beach that day. He died of a heart attack 5 weeks later and been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He never got the second chance that Allen was now receiving. The 104th entered combat in October 1944, and almost immediately proved that Allen had built another exceptional fighting unit. They spearheaded drives across Holland, pierced the Siegfried Line, and fought their way into Germany. Bradley, now commanding the 12th Army Group, visited Allen in Cologne and was forced to acknowledge what he was seeing. "Terry, I'm pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours already ranked along with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theater." Allen's response was perfect. "Brad, the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." The 104th fought for 195 consecutive days after landing in France, never losing a single engagement. They captured major German industrial cities, took more than 50,000 prisoners, and pushed all the way to the Elbe River. On April 26, 1945, they became the first American division to link up with Soviet forces, marking the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Later, Omar Bradley wrote in grudging admiration that Allen brought the only division I know of that was prepared for night combat. It was as close to an apology as Bradley would ever offer. Terry Allen never lost a battle in World War II. In fact, he never lost a battle in his entire military career. He proved that his methods worked, that his style of leadership produced results, that he could impose discipline when needed while still maintaining the aggressive, can-do spirit that made his divisions exceptional. Yet his vindication came with a shadow. The army that emerged from World War II had no place for more Terry Allens. The military establishment had made its choice. They wanted officers who colored inside the lines, who followed procedures, who prioritized fitting in over standing out. The maverick combat leader who inspired fanatical loyalty while showing contempt for rear echelon bureaucracy. That was a species marked for extinction. So what do we make of Terry Allen's story? Was he a victim of jealous superiors who couldn't stand his success? Or was he a problem officer whose insubordination threatened military cohesion? The uncomfortable truth is that he was both. Allen's combat record speaks for itself. Under his leadership, the 1st Infantry Division became one of the finest assault units in the Army. His 104th Division matched that achievement. His emphasis on night fighting revolutionized infantry tactics. His philosophy of inflict maximum damage to the enemy with minimum casualties to ourselves saved countless American lives. The men he led respected him, trusted him, and would have followed him anywhere. But Allen also cultivated a division culture that placed loyalty to him above loyalty to the Army. His soldiers believed they were special, exempt from normal rules because of their combat record. When rear echelon troops in Oran blocked access to their facilities, Allen's response wasn't to enforce discipline, but to tacitly endorse his men teaching those rear echelon troops a lesson. He routinely ignored regulations he thought were stupid, sending a clear message to his subordinates that rules were optional if you had good enough reasons to break them. In a small professional army, that might have been manageable. Eisenhower and Bradley could have worked around one difficult genius. But America in World War II was building a massive military machine that would eventually put millions of men under arms. That machine required standardization, predictability, and a clear chain of command. You couldn't run an army of that size if every successful division commander started thinking he could ignore orders from above. Yet there's something deeply troubling about how Allen was treated. He was fired at the peak of his success, removed from command while his face was literally appearing on magazine covers celebrating his victories. The official justifications for his relief didn't match the facts, and the people pushing hardest for his removal were officers like Bradley, who'd spent decades in the army without ever facing combat until they were suddenly put in charge of men who'd been fighting and dying for months. There's an old saying in the military, those who can do and those who can't become staff officers. It's not entirely fair, but it captures a real tension that has existed in every army throughout history. The people who are best at making war are often not the people who are best at managing peacetime military bureaucracies, and vice versa. Terry Allen was exceptional at making war. He understood viscerally what it took to inspire men to do the impossible, to attack when every instinct screamed to take cover, to keep pushing forward when exhaustion and fear said to stop. He knew that wars were won by soldiers willing to close with and destroy the enemy, not by officers sitting in comfortable headquarters issuing reports. But he had no patience for, and no skill at, the political maneuvering required to survive in a large military bureaucracy. He couldn't or wouldn't play the game of managing up, of making his superiors feel important, of sacrificing substance for appearance. When someone criticized his division, Allen's instinct was to defend his men and damn the consequences. When someone issued what he considered a stupid order, he found ways to ignore it. When officers who'd never heard shots fired in combat tried to lecture him about soldiering, he made his contempt clear. In the end, that contempt destroyed his command of the 1st Division. Not his tactical mistakes, because he made very few. Not his combat losses, because he consistently won. His contempt for people in power who he thought were fools. The system got its revenge by removing him from the division he'd built. But the system also couldn't quite bring itself to throw him away entirely, because men like George Marshall knew that wars ultimately required commanders like Allen. So he got his second chance, proved himself all over again, and then quietly retired when the war was over. The story of Terry Allen exposes something fundamental about how power works in large organizations, military or otherwise. Success, even extraordinary success, is not protection against political destruction. Being right doesn't matter if the wrong people decide you're a problem. And the very qualities that make you exceptional at your job can be exactly what makes you intolerable to the people in charge. Allen won every battle he fought. He transformed 2 divisions into elite fighting units. He saved countless American lives through innovative tactics and aggressive leadership. By any objective measure, he was one of the most successful combat commanders America produced in World War II, but he also threatened the established order. His success came through methods that couldn't be replicated across the entire army. His leadership style created units that were loyal to him first and the army second. His open disdain for regulations and rear echelon bureaucracy undermined the authority of officers who were trying to build a modern military institution. From Eisenhower and Bradley's perspective, Allen was a successful problem. Yes, he won battles, but he also set a dangerous example. If every division commander started acting like Allen, how would you maintain coherent operations across multiple fronts? How would you enforce standards when every commander thought his combat record exempted him from following rules? How would you prevent the army from fracturing into personal fiefdoms led by charismatic warlords? These weren't unreasonable concerns. History is littered with armies that fell apart because successful commanders refused to subordinate themselves to central authority. The Roman Republic collapsed in part because its greatest generals built personal armies more loyal to them than to Rome. Modern militaries have learned that lesson and built institutional safeguards against it. But those safeguards come with costs. By making it clear that individualism and insubordination would not be tolerated no matter how successful you were, the Army sent a message to every ambitious officer. Your career depends more on pleasing your superiors than on winning battles. Play the political game. Don't make waves. Color inside the lines. Excellence in combat is important, but fitting in is more important. The post-World War II, American military became very good at producing officers like Omar Bradley, careful, diplomatic, skilled at navigating bureaucracy, capable of managing large organizations. It became much less good at producing officers like Terry Allen, aggressive, intuitive, inspiring, willing to break rules to achieve victory. You can debate whether that trade-off was worth it. What's undeniable is that it happened, and the relief of Terry Allen was one of the key moments that signaled the shift. Terry Allen retired from the Army in 1946 at the rank of Major General. He never received the 3rd star that his combat record probably warranted. He never commanded a corps, never got the recognition that lesser commanders received. He spent the rest of his life largely out of the public eye, dying in 1969 in El Paso, Texas. His son, Terry Allen Jr., became an Army officer and commander of the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry in Vietnam. In October 1967, the younger Allen was killed in action. Father and son now rest together in the National Cemetery at Fort Bliss, two soldiers who gave everything to their country and received complicated legacies in return. The military establishment that sidelined Terry Allen Sr. went on to dominate American defense policy for decades. The emphasis on cooperation over individualism, on process over results, on political skill over combat prowess, these became the defining features of the modern American military. Whether that made the military more or less effective is a question that probably can't be answered definitively. What we can say is that armies need both types of officers. They need the Bradleys who can manage massive organizations, coordinate complex operations, and navigate political realities. They also need the Allens who can inspire men to do the impossible, who understand at a gut level what combat requires, who care more about winning than about following procedures. The genius of the Army is supposed to be its ability to identify both types and use them appropriately. The tragedy of Terry Allen's story is that it suggests the system is better at identifying threats to institutional authority than at recognizing exceptional combat leadership. George Marshall understood this. He looked at Allen and saw a man who was difficult, insubordinate, and impossible to control through normal channels. He also saw a man who knew how to win battles and inspire soldiers. Marshall decided that America needed men like Allen even if they made life difficult for officers like Bradley. Eisenhower and Bradley looked at the same man and saw an officer who threatened to undermine military discipline and institutional authority. They decided that the long-term health of the Army required removing such officers, regardless of their combat records. Both perspectives had merit. Both were partially right. The question is, which perspective should dominate when they come into conflict? In Terry Allen's case, the institutional perspective won. He was removed from command, sent home, and nearly destroyed. Only Marshall's intervention gave him a second chance to prove his worth. And even then, the system made sure there weren't any more chances after that. The fact that we're still talking about Terry Allen more than 75 years later suggests that maybe, just maybe, the system got it wrong. Wars are ultimately won by soldiers doing the hard, bloody work of closing with and destroying the enemy. And those soldiers deserve commanders who inspire them, who understand what they're going through, who will fight for them as hard as they're fighting for their country. Terry Allen was that kind of commander. He shouldn't have been forced out of the 1st Division at the peak of his success. He should have been celebrated, promoted, and given even greater responsibilities. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about what happens when you're too successful in ways that make your superiors uncomfortable. The modern American military would be better if it had more room for officers like Terry Allen. It would probably also be more chaotic, more difficult to control, and more prone to spectacular individual failures. Whether that trade-off would be worth it is something each generation of military leaders has to decide for themselves. But here's what we know for certain. When Terry Allen led soldiers into battle, they followed him. They trusted him. They believed in him. And under his leadership, they never lost. That should count for something.